I'm going to I'm going to give an explanation of the whole Bible in 14 minutes. That's my goal. And in order to understand the Bible, I think one should follow the Jewish canon for what we call the Old Testament. In other words, the Hebrew Bible, which is the same Bible that Protestants accept for the Old Testament. Catholics add some other books that need not concern us here. They interrupt the whole structure and flow of it. And I think that the Bible Jesus used was the Hebrew canon as we have it now, um, at least the first book and the last book, and most of the sections of the Bible, with some uncertainty as to the third category, which is the writings. So the Hebrew Bible is divided into three main parts: the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Everybody agrees on that. And then you've got the prophets, which are divided into two groups: the former prophets, which are the 4 books that follow the Pentateuch, in other words, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then you've got the latter prophets, which is what Christians normally refer to as the prophets. And here you also have, I think, 3 or 4 great scrolls: the 3 great scrolls of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then a 4th scroll wherein all 12, what Christians call minor prophets, can fit. And then you have a third category called the Psalms, or rather the writings, which are called the Psalms in the Emmaus story. In Luke 24, Jesus says that everything written in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms about him had to be fulfilled. So the third category begins with the Psalms, which is also a 5-book work, by the way, like the Torah. And it ends with Chronicles, which we have evidence of that when Jesus wants to accuse his generation of all the blood spilled in the Bible, basically, beginning with the blood of Abel in Genesis, and ending with the blood of Zechariah, killed in the what we call the 2nd book of Chronicles. So that the Bible, the Old Testament, is really a Genesis to Chronicles collection of books. And Chronicles itself begins with the first word being Adam. So that, in a sense, Chronicles is a recapitulation of everything that went on before. It's actually a rereading of the former prophets. We're going to explain that a little bit in a second. And it also ends on a very significant note for Jews and even for Christians, which is the last word, let him go up. And this is the Aliyah, this is the return of Jews to the Holy Land. You always go up to Mount Zion. You go down into Egypt, the place of slavery. You go up to the temple on Zion, the presence of the Lord. And the whole Bible can be looked as the story of creation and paradise and being with God, and sin getting in the way, resulting in the first exile. Catholics still pray poor, exiled, or banished children of Eve. And then you have a prototypical liberation from slavery and exile in Egypt, followed by much later another liberation now from the north in Babylon, which the prophets say will make the first Exodus to be forgotten. And then finally, you have in the book of Chronicles, ending on a positive note, with the decree of Cyrus, the Persian, the new empire, allowing the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. And that is a paradigm, really, even for Jews today. That temple was also destroyed by the Romans, the last empire, if you want, that is involved in the Bible. And now the Jews, if they expect the temple to be rebuilt, it'll be rebuilt by the Messiah. And but they can still make the Aliyah. They can still go back to Israel, go to Israel to their own homeland, especially after the Nazi Holocaust that we celebrate the memory of today. Remember the memory of the Holocaust today. And so therefore the Bible ends on that note of hope that the temple will be rebuilt and the Jews will return home from all the dispersed places, the diaspora where they were. And it ends with these words, let him go up. And of course, for Christians, the one who builds the temple is Jesus. It's the temple, that's the church. He's the one that goes up to the presence of the Father. The letter to the Hebrews talks about a new and living way that he inaugurates right to the very presence of God's sanctuary, where he sits at the right hand. So how do these three parts of the Old Testament fit together? The Torah, the first 5 books, as I said, begins with creation and harmony and paradise, but ends with what many translations say, a coffin in Egypt. So it ends with the sad note that the Jews wind up in Egypt with Joseph because of a famine. And then shortly thereafter, a change of government makes things miserable for the Israelites. They're not really Jews yet. Jews will come from the tribe of Judah. And it's really something that happens in the Babylonian exile, that it becomes from a geographical designation, people from the tribe of Judah are Yehudim or Jews, to religiously converted, adamant monotheists who keep kosher and circumcision and the Sabbath and all these things. So Genesis leads to Exodus, where they fulfill, in a sense, the promises of multiplying and filling the land, but they are oppressed, so they then have to go to, they have to leave Egypt, and where they go and led by Moses is Sinai, which will occupy a big chunk of the Pentateuch, from Exodus 19 to Numbers 10 or 11. The whole book of Leviticus in the middle all takes place in Sinai, or called Horeb by another biblical school of writers. And there, that's the holy mountain. That's where they get the 10 Commandments, which they break almost immediately with the golden calf, or golden calves, in Exodus 32. Then in Leviticus, the central book of the Pentateuch, you've got all the rules regarding what to do when God is in your midst as a powerful radioactive force. Radioactive energy can be very useful, but it can zap you if you are not careful with it. And that's the first half of Leviticus. The middle chapter of Leviticus is Leviticus 16, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which scholars don't know how to place. The first part is really a very priestly, ritualistic part of Leviticus. And 17 through 26 in the end there become a social. That's where it says, love your neighbor as yourself, and all the rules regarding sexuality and all kinds of other things. And the scholars tell us that this was a priestly adaptation and reaction to the prophets criticizing an empty cult of pure ritual and concern for ritual purity with the neglect of social justice. Amos says, I am tired of your feasts, your holocaust, your sacrifices are disgusting to me. Let justice flow. And so this holiness school, this priestly school, be holy as I, the Lord, am holy, they adopt all these social rules that are very, very ethical, as is the Jewish religion in general. They continue with this presence in Sinai in the first 10 chapters of Numbers. They arrange themselves as a military liturgical camp. And they embark, they pick up their tent tags and set off, tent pegs and set off. The minute they leave Sinai, everything breaks down. They start murmuring. They want to go back to Egypt, undo God's plan. And in fact, everyone has to die. All the Israelites, including Moses and Aaron, will die. And only two leaders, Joshua and Caleb, and the little ones who don't know right or wrong, will enter the promised land. The two leaders, Joshua, which is Hebrew for Jesus, if you want to look at it that way, and Caleb is a pagan who's joined Israel, and his name means dog, so that's kind of interesting. And then finally they have their big blowout in Numbers 25. They're in Moab, which is a dirty place. Moab and Ammon were the sons of an incestuous, drunken union of Lot and his daughters. So these are biblical etiologies or genealogies that explain why people are impure or the way they are. And so Numbers ends on this place of exile, which is the land of Moab. Anteroom, lobby, waiting room, but not yet the fulfillment. And the whole Torah will end on a note of non-fulfillment. The book of Deuteronomy all takes place in one day. Moses does all his speeches in that day. He goes over the whole history of the desert, even though there's a mention of creation in Deuteronomy that makes it as some sort of a second Torah, which would be the translation of this Greek word. Deuteronomy, second law. In Hebrew, they call it the Mishneh Torah, the repetition of the Torah. He recounts everything. And even though he's very healthy and vigorous, needs no Viagra, I always like to say, God has commanded him to go up the mountain and drop dead, basically. And it says, no prophet is yet arisen in Israel like Moses, who spoke to God face to face. What follows the Pentateuch? Well, these 4 books that we call the former prophets. I call it a history of failure. In Joshua, they conquer the land. And in what we call 2 Kings, the land is lost. And in fact, an editor in 2 Kings 25, verse 26, has said that everyone from the smallest to the largest went back to Egypt. So the whole salvation of the Exodus is undone, and the curse in Deuteronomy 28:69 is fulfilled. They go back to Egypt, and Deuteronomy 28:69 says, and they will try to sell themselves as slaves again, but this time no one will even buy. So they were worse off than when they started. That's how the former prophets end. They're followed by the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. And these prophets, whatever their message was originally, and most of it is doomsday, and Amos and Hosea are considered to be the 2 prophets that speak of when God's patience comes to an end. They have all been edited to be harbingers of salvation, in some cases messianic salvation. So the latter prophets is what happens after that, halftime pep talk, if you want, in the exile. Tremendous leaders in Babylon exhorted the Jews to convert and repent and go over their history. My Professor Blenkinsop spoke of finding a salvageable past, understanding what has happened to you in such a way that you can learn from it and go ahead and start a new life. And it's all in preparation for returning to the land. This great Hebrew verb shuv, where teshuvah, conversion, comes from on Yom Kippur. And it both means return to the land, turning of fortunes, end of captivity, and conversion. It's all related. So the land is a symbol of the presence of God in paradise. And you have a physical turning and a spiritual turning. And so that's what the prophets are about. The last one is Malachi, who speaks, of course, of the return of Elijah, who represents the prophets. He doesn't have his own book, but he's in the former prophets in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. So the return of Elijah was expected to prepare the way of the Messiah in Judaism. They still leave a place for him in the Seder table. And Christians look at the chapter 3 of Malachi as John the Baptist's vocation narrative, prepare the way of the Lord. And so that is how we can look at the law and the prophets, which are the two components that flank Jesus in the transfiguration, Moses and Elijah, who, by the way, in Luke 9:31 are speaking to Jesus about his exodus that he was to fulfill in Jerusalem. So that very few translations have that. The New Vulgate does, and the NAB Catholic Lectionary Bible use Exodus, just like the Greek of Luke. Others say his demise, his decease, etc. But Jesus is really the one that leads this new Exodus for Christians. What can we say about the third part, the Psalms? We already said a little bit, but the Psalms is a 5-book work, and it begins with the blessings of the man, etc., ends with hallelujahs, and these are all very sincere prayers, whether of thanksgiving or supplication or lament, that Christians believe Jesus fulfilled. And then you've got some other books that I'm not concerned about right now, but then the last 3 books would be Daniel in the Jewish canon, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. In some canons of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, Daniel is the last book, preceded by the last 3 great prophets, who are in turn preceded by the 12. So we have a slightly different order. But what's interesting about that is to end with Daniel, which ends with resurrection. And Daniel 13 and 14 are in the Catholic Bible, but not the Protestant or Jewish Bible. The real Daniel 12 ends with resurrection and sealing of the book until he wakes up. So that is an incredibly great book to end especially the Christian canon with, of the Old Testament. And we don't have much time to speak about the New Testament at this time, but I promised, I don't know how long I've spoken, but I assume it's around 14 minutes. And I hope somebody has found this useful. Thank you.